evening and welcome to Between the Lines. I'm John Matisonn. My guest tonight is Sipho Pityana of the Save South Africa campaign. Very happy to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much, John, to you and your viewers.
You're known for your role in the Save South Africa campaign and for being a strong critic of the way the political situation is declining.
Yes.
But I want to go back to your earlier history because you've emerged onto the national scene at a different level. You were an activist in the 70s and you joined the ANC when it was still dangerous.
Yes, I was an activist in the 70s of the 1976 generation. My involvement goes far back to 1975. So we engineered the 1976 uprisings and the students, young students movement. I also got involved in the emergence of civic organizations. In those days, one of the pioneering civic organization which was a catalyst to emergence of a SANCO was Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization.
Yes, I remember.
Which was a very radical movement. And that's when I began to have connections with the ANC. We went as a delegation and met with the ANC leadership under crises in Lesotho. And then I subsequently joined the trade union movement. So I've been on this journey since then.
And you were detained without trial?
I was detained several times, and as you would expect it, baptized through torture. And all of that.
And then you were banned?
And subsequently I was banned following a long spell of detention as a trade unionist. Many would remember one of my inspirational leaders in the labor movement at that time was a fellow called Dr. Neil Agat, with whom we were detained in that major swoop on unions in 1981. Of course, he was tortured with us, and unfortunately he didn't survive detention in those years. He was detained in Johannesburg with others who were detained in Port Elizabeth. It's then that after our release we were served with a banning order. At that time, ANC decided it was time for me to go.
Now, the Port Elizabeth security police were particularly vicious.
Absolutely.
How bad was your experience?
It was quite bad. It was quite severe. Remember, around the time we were being arrested as student activists, that's when, in fact, in 1976, George Botha, a colored teacher, was killed in detention. 1977, Steve Biko was killed in the same place where we were detained. The guys there were particularly right-wing, very vicious, violent fellows. They had no sense of politics, but they were basically your runners, and they went mad on you, and once they had access to you. So it was the sharp end of the brutal system of apartheid. But remember, Port Elizabeth was the hotbed of politics. The first 3 MK commanders who were executed, Vuisile Mini, Kayinga, and Kaba, were from Port Elizabeth. And that was in the early 60s. So it tells you something about the extent of the viciousness and the brutality of the system in that part of the world at the time.
Now, you eventually went into exile in the 80s, and you obtained a BA Honours and a Master's in an MSc in the UK, and your subjects were government, sociology, and politics.
That's correct.
And so finally, and then you coordinated the International Reception Committee for Nelson Mandela when he came out of prison.
Yes, I mean, part of my involvement in the ANC during my exile years was largely around underground activities that were interfacing the ANC in exile and the labor movement in South Africa, remembering that I left South Africa as a trade union activist.
Right.
To introduce some of the emerging trade union leaders to ensure that they are connected to the ANC and they can assist in the building of a mass democratic movement that's very well connected to the ANC. That's work that we were doing already when we were in South Africa. And secondly, and probably most importantly, is that I was deployed in the international relations work of the ANC, which was building the international anti-apartheid movement, whether it was the students' formation or international trade union movement and others.
I-
So the role of being, of leading the Nelson Mandela International Reception Committee
came from that.
Came naturally.
Followed naturally.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to the current period, but just one more thing about your CV. You were Director General of Foreign Affairs in the Mbeki era.
Yes. Well,
And, sorry.
well, my first stint in government was as a Director General of Labour in the Mandela administration, and I was moved from there to Director General of International Relations, remembering that in the Exile years, Thabo Mbeki was a Director of International Affairs.
I want to move to the current period. You're now the leading figure and the face of Save South Africa. What is the objective? What are you trying to achieve with that?
Save South Africa is a campaign, by the way. And it's a culmination of efforts by civil society formations that goes back a number of years. What brought it about was a need we felt to focus on asserting the need and the restoration of ethical, accountable leadership characterized by integrity in the context of a constitutional democracy through active citizenship.
I want to come back to this further, but just before we go to the break, was there one incident that, I mean, we can see so many things going wrong at the moment in the current era, but was there one thing that drove you to say, no, now I've got to act?
Well, the vacillation, if you like, and the prevarication by President Zuma in face of the finding of public protector around Nkandla clearly raised the alarms that we have a president here who is quite determined to not give due regard to our constitution and to disrespect the authority of Chapter 9 institutions and indeed of the courts.
We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Sipho Pityana of the Save South Africa campaign. Sipho, before the President's SONA speech, the State of the Nation address, you gave an alternative State of the Nation address in St. George's Cathedral.
Yes.
That reminded me of the days of the United Democratic Front and of the time where people used spaces, safe spaces like St. George's, not that it was always safe, of course, as a way to start to mobilize opposition to a government that was going wrong.
Well, we call it the real state of the nation. And you're right to flash back to the days of the United Democratic Front. Because, in fact, State of the Nation address is a very important feature of our democratic order and in a constitutional environment, because it affords a platform for accountable leadership. Now, part of saying this is the real state of the nation is to suggest that you can't have a leader who has no regard for accountability, a leader who has no regard for the Constitution and what it represents, being received to deliver the state of the nation, because in fact he should not be in office. So the real state of the nation is an account by people of South Africa who face that daily experience and can be believed when they deliver and reflect on their circumstances and their lives. And that's why we had it in the format that it was, and we had people from the health sector, education, social services, small enterprises, et cetera, come and do a presentation on what they're doing, gender activists across the board. So that was the format, and of course we rounded it up with a reflection on behalf of Save South Africa that I presented.
Now, if proof were needed, you got proof that what you were saying had some validity when you held a press conference and it was disrupted. Who was behind that and what happened?
Well, it's a sign of the times. that you in a democratic space, you have people who come in a press conference of an organization where it interacts with society broadly, instead of engaging against what you're saying if they don't agree with it, they use force and disrupt. They were ostensibly acting in defense of President Zuma, as they said when they came to the meeting, and they were asserting that we are trying to divide the ANC. So you would assume that they were acting on behalf of the ANC. I wouldn't suggest that they were sent, but that's what they asserted.
Now, the question that arises for me, I interviewed in this place Dennis Goldberg,
yes,
about one of the stalwarts, when they Sydney Mufamadi,
yeah,
also when they put out their document with more than 100 signatures, which at first had a dismissive response from, yes, the Luthuli House, from the Secretary General, but later they've had more discussions. The question that arises, especially when we think about the UDF, is there coordination taking place? The UDF became so powerful because it represented so many organizations, yes, yes, including, as you say, the, yes, civics, which, yes, were a key part, and the unions. Is anything like that in prospect?
Well, gladly I can say that I'm one of the signatories to the petition that was sent by the Stalwarts to the, yes, leadership of the ANC. What we have here is not too dissimilar to what we saw in the era of the United Democratic Front, except that we have the benefit of a permissive democratic space, which was not there in the period. So we can organize openly, and we can express our views.
With the occasional disruption.
Okay, we have an occasional disruption, but of course we have sanctions also that come, yes, in ways that make it difficult for people to feel that they can come on board. Either they get blocked, or their business opportunities are shut down, or their employment prospects get limited, etc., etc. What we have is a formal free speech and free expression in the Constitution, sure, circumvented in other ways by sanctions that get meted out. So this is a very important space that has been created here. As I say, for instance, the Council for the Advancement of South African Constitution, which I chair, was formed in 2010, and we put together a blueprint then, which we shared with government, around how you deal with corruption, and how you challenge corruption in society, and how you use the legal and constitutional framework that is already in place to stop corruption from happening. And government refused to meet us. And on the council there we have ANC luminaries and very prominent people from broader society who are not necessarily members of the ANC. And when the Marikana massacre happened, we raised alarm bells that there was growing securitization of the state. You have a language that talks about shoot to kill. You have an increasingly an intolerant tone coming from government that suggests that we are moving back to our ugly past. So all of these things were beginning to show. When Andres Tatane was killed for participating in civic protest, we raised the alarm bells. We reported the matter to the Human Rights Commission. Other organizations that are involved with us here, I can allude to the fact that they have been involved similarly in raising all of these concerns.
We're about to go to a break, so I have a quick question for you, and that is, what's the difference between Save South Africa and the Stalwarts? It seems that Save South Africa is directly calling for President Zuma to go, whereas among the Stalwarts, not some of them do, but some of them don't, and they're all talking about a broader engagement with the ANC.
Well, it is all of that and more. Save South Africa is exactly that. It is not about saving the ANC, it's about saving South Africa.
Right.
And it's saying that if saving South Africa comes at a price that might be unacceptable to some, that's exactly what we must do.
Yeah.
Well, it's about putting the country first. It is saying that the vision of a liberation struggle that we pursued has been codified in the constitutional framework that we have, and therefore we must make sure that we protect that. So it may very well be that Jacob Zuma has been captured, so has the ANC. Our preoccupation as a country must be about ensuring that the country doesn't get captured as well.
Thank you. We'll take a break and we'll be right back. And we're back with Sipho Pityana of the Save South Africa campaign. I suppose the question is, what's next? What are you going to do? What's your next plan to take this campaign forward?
Well, the campaign is designed by the various endorsing organizations and its steering committee, as I indicated. But of course, it is largely driven by developments in the political landscape, and in large measure, those developments evolve around what President Zuma does and does not do. Our principal focus is that President Zuma, who has been found by no less a body than the Constitutional Court to have failed to honor his oath of office, and that he has failed to uphold, defend, and protect the Constitution as it is his principal responsibility, and that Parliament has an obligation in law as an oversight body to deliberate, reflect, and say what an appropriate sanction is for somebody who is in breach of the supreme law of the land, taking into account the fact that there is a precedence in that two cabinet ministers, in former Minister Gwen Mahlangu Nkabinde and former Minister Dina Pule, who for lesser offenses were forced to resign. What happened?
But also similar, because they were also sanctioned by or criticized by the public protector.
They were criticized by the public protector. The president has been criticized by the public protector, and the president has been scathingly criticized by a unanimous bench of the Constitutional Court. You cannot get a stronger sanction than that. And clearly what this means is that Parliament has to impose a sanction. Our assertion is that that sanction has to be that the president must go. So that's our principal focus. And of course, we are particularly concerned that as if that has not happened, we get revelations arising from another public protector's report that the president is busy in the middle of selling out the sovereignty of the nation to a bunch of crooks and thieves and criminals at that, in that they appoint cabinet ministers, they appoint leading leaders in key and critical institutions of government, a role preserved to the head of state acting on behalf of a nation that has fought and won its right to self-determination. When he hands that right to somebody else, that's selling out our sovereignty. So clearly that's quite shocking. And of course we have very worrying rumors that the president has already committed to the Russians
on the nuclear deal.
On a nuclear deal that will cost over R1 trillion, and that's more than the total budget of our country, and that will condemn generations to be enslaved to Russians. So we can't fight to be free from apartheid only to be enslaved to Russians. So it is a fight for the sovereignty of our country. It is not just a petty fight against somebody that you hate, that Jacob Zuma is. It is a fight to protect the sovereignty of our nation, the independence of our country, economic prosperity, and the future for our children.
Now, with your other hat among the stalwarts, what the stalwarts are calling for, and I'm sure you support this, is for a consultative conference of the ANC, which would not be controlled by the existing leadership, that the stalwarts would set up a mechanism so that they can have a proper independent debate about the future of the ANC. So you support that, obviously.
I do support that. There are genuine efforts that have been presented to the ANC to say that in Jacob Zuma we have a leader who is not fit to govern. We have a National Executive Committee that has failed the country, that has failed the ANC, and therefore create space for systematic introspection that is not like a fireside chat that is not going to land us anywhere, but actually structure it as a consultative conference that will have recommendations that will be binding on the leadership, that it must execute and ensure that credible elective conference is held at a point.
Yes.
And you can't, in the current environment, have a credible elective conference because you have all kinds of things that ANC leadership speaks to. Corrupt practices in the constitution of branches, election of leaders in branches, election of regional and provincial structures that culminates in a reproduction, constant reproduction of a corrupt leadership that makes it difficult for ANC to lead with integrity. And of course, following the shock outcome of the 3rd August local government elections, it's exercising the mind that if you go on and do things the same way that you've done before without assuring South African public, you're going to get the same result, you're going to get a corrupt leadership. So clearly, you need to do things differently to ensure and assure the South African public that you can produce a leadership that will be very different from the Jacob Zuma leadership and that will be deserving of leading the South African government.
The Stalwarts group started off asking for a meeting with John Matisonn, the Secretary General of the ANC. He wrote back quite dismissively. In fact, Sydney Mufamadi on this show, former minister, said he told us to write essays.
Yes.
Explain who you are and all of that sort of thing when everybody knows who you are. They've since made some progress, but I want to ask you, what happens if, obviously there's a lot of stalling and maneuvering on the other side. If that doesn't get very far, at what point do you jump, cut bait? Do you actually say, we have to start talking to parties other than the ANC?
Well, I know, all of us are an old hand in these matters. It's quite blatant that what you're seeing happening here is that the NEC has taken a view that instead of having the Stalwarts and the MK Council that met subsequent to the Stalwarts ranting and raving outside of the ANC like Save South Africa is doing, it's better to manage them inside and do so without giving in to what they want. Right. But you keep them inside and you have you have a chart that doesn't take you anywhere.
So how far are you prepared to go?
Well, by the time they are so upset and disappointed with what's happening, it will be June, and in June that's what they wanted to have, is to have an elective conference, and on the back of the elective conference, in fact, at the same time as the elective conference, you have this national consultative conference, and then you also have a build-up to
the election of the president.
The election of the president at the end of the year. And guess what? You will not have moved with the kind of urgency that ANC members have directed the leadership to move at.
So what will you do?
Well, it's quite clear you have a national executive committee in the ANC that is concerned and preoccupied with their own self-preservation rather than focusing on ensuring that the ANC lives another day. Unfortunately, what this might mean is that the demise of Zuma might mark the demise of the ANC.
A gloomy note to end on, but maybe not altogether gloomy. We have to end. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, John, and to your listeners.
Before we go, I'm going to recommend one book. It's My Own Liberator, a memoir by Dikgang Moseneke, the former Deputy Chief Justice. I went to recently listen to him talk at the University of Cape Town, and what struck me was how crisp his mind is. And I'm not going to quote you anything from the book. It's really worth reading, and I recommend it. But I will just say this from something he said at the meeting. He spoke very highly of our Constitution and how American Supreme Court judges had told him it was the best in the world, better than the American. But he also had a critical reservation. He said there are several defects in the Constitution, and one of them is the imperial presidency. If he was involved in writing the Constitution today, he would have given the president less powers than he has. We have to leave it at that. Thanks for watching. Good night and happy reading.